Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. Teddy, the brown field spaniel, was sitting waiting by the door. All morning, a sad man named Parker purposefully moved around the four-story house. They were going somewhere. Parker packed a bag the night before and spent the morning walking and feeding Teddy, closing and locking all windows and doors. These actions meant a trip, and Teddy resigned himself to the fact that he was going to have a long trip in a big black car. It wasn't always like that. Teddy was happy with Anne. He had only a vague idea of what had happened before Anne. She was there when he grew from a puppy to an adult dog. They lived in an apartment in a big city in the South. Going out for a walk, we rode the elevator. There were no stairs. In the same multi-story building, there was only a staircase, and a person was constantly walking up and down it. Teddy explored every floor except the last one. They never went up to the fourth floor. Each floor of the house was as big as Anne's apartment, but they were cold, lonely spaces. Teddy missed Anne and her warm, sunny apartment. Teddy lived with Anne for 6 years, although she had hardly been home for the last year. They went everywhere together, inseparable companions. If you were traveling in a car, then in a yellow taxi, and always sat with Teddy in the back seat. He was sitting at her feet, and she was hugging him. Parker had a big black car called an SUV, and Teddy was pushed into his back seat. It bothered him, especially after he lost Anne. The trouble came with the smell. One morning, Teddy woke up on the corner of Anne's bed to a strange smell. Teddy's nose was very sensitive. His breed is distinguished by the ability to sense what is hidden, what is disguised under other smells. He was there, a faint, intoxicating smell. He couldn't tell her that. He had no way to warn her of the danger, but he became more affectionate to compensate for it. As time went on, the smell affected and more. One day, she left Teddy in the care of Liz, who lived in the apartment next door, and told Liz, "Teddy is not used to being alone. I'll be back tomorrow, just one night for tests." Liz had a cat named Simon who wouldn't leave Teddy alone. He insisted on rubbing up against the friendly brown dog. Because of Liz's cat, the spaniel had to stay alone in Anne's apartment. Liz was good, but not Anne, and was gloomy when she returned. Teddy did his best to cheer her up. However, a period began when Anne left, always saying that she would be back soon. When she left, the unpleasant smell was strong, and when she returned it became less, but it never completely disappeared. After Anne left for the first time, Liz or another neighbor came to feed and walk Teddy, but mostly he was left alone. Teddy was looking forward to Anne's return, and for a while, everything became almost normal. Except Anne was getting weaker and weaker, and their walks were getting shorter. Soon they hardly left the apartment anymore, and left for the last time, hugging Teddy tightly, but did not promise to return. Teddy waited and waited. At night, the apartment was dark and lifeless. Liz or someone else came once or twice a day, no more. Teddy was alone. And then the day came when Liz fed him and said with tears in her eyes, "Your new master is coming this afternoon." A man named Parker came that day. There was a deep sadness coming from him that Teddy could see and feel. Liz let Parker in, and they gathered Teddy's bowls and toys, the coat he wore in winter, the rug, and the blanket he slept on. Parker put a leash on Teddy's collar and tried to get him out of the apartment, but Teddy recoiled. He needed, and Parker seemed to understand. The man knelt down and said, "She's not coming back, boy, and you know it. She died in the hospital, in the room next to the one where my wife was lying. They both left. I promised to take care of you." The man stroked Teddy's head and patted him lightly, and Teddy got up and left the apartment. Teddy rode in an elevator for the last time. He was sitting in the back seat of a big black car all alone, and they drove far away. We arrived at his strange house, where we now lived alone. Teddy could smell the woman gone and the man's pain, so similar to his own. They were together, but each of them was still alone. Parker Jones met his wife, Lenore, in Chicago, in the summer of his sophomore year of law school. In college, where physics is mainly taught, he entered the law faculty, hoping to become a patent attorney. However, the only summer internship he managed to get was at an arbitration firm. The arbitration judges desperately needed a person who understood fiberglass wiring to help with a major construction case in Chicago. Parker, who worked laying cables for AT&T during college, accepted a job outside the state. In Chicago, having nothing to do on the weekend, one Saturday morning he went on an excursion to the Art Institute. Lenore, Lynn, Campbell was 23 years old. She had a master's degree in fine arts. She painted in oils and acrylics, but couldn't find any other lucrative job besides working as a tour guide. Parker bought a ticket for the tour, but spent his time watching the pretty, petite blonde tour guide. He followed her through the decorated rooms of the museum. He never found the courage to talk to the woman he liked. In total, he visited the tour 3 times in a row on Saturday morning. At the end of the third tour, Lenore came up to him and said, "Hi, I'm Lenore, but people call me Lynn. And I'm also quite impatient, so here's my phone number and address. I'm free every night except Tuesday." Lenore took the first step, and during the summer the relationship flared up. Introverted Parker quickly fell in love with the lively, sociable Miss Campbell. The interaction was perfect, opposites attracted in a fit of passion. They were both virgins and remained so until mid-August. Arriving at Lenore's apartment for a Friday movie date, Parker discovered that her roommate had left for the weekend. The film was released on Netflix DVD in Lenore's bedroom. Lenore took pills just in case. They got very excited from each other, but the first time didn't last long. Fortunately, they found that Parker recovers quickly and lasts much longer after the first case. However, Sunday morning came too early, and Lenore was thoughtful and a little distant. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "No, just that our weekend is coming to an end. There will be other weekends, and weekdays too. Unless that's your way of leaving me." "No, no," she said, moving closer for a kiss. "I just can't keep working as a guide on a minimum wage. I need a real job to pay my expenses until I become an artist. I used to think that success would come right away, but it didn't happen." "Well, you're very talented, and I'm sure you'll find something. I'd like to help, but I'm just a summer intern. I'll be fired at the end of the month." She laughed and said, "That's the point. I found something. Next week I'm starting a teacher training program in New York at Brooklyn College. This will give me a degree in education and allow me to teach art in public schools. I planned our weekend considering that it could be the last one for a long time." Now it was Parker's turn. He laughed and said, "That's funny. I'm going back to NYU a week after you leave for Brooklyn." They moved in together that fall and got married the following year, as soon as he graduated from law school. He was hired as a junior lawyer in an arbitration firm. It wasn't his dream job, but he agreed to it to support them. Lenore had trouble finding a job as a teacher. Before the birth of their first son, Daniel, she worked part-time as a substitute teacher. She spent the next year caring for Daniel and painting. Being at the lowest position in the firm, Parker had to travel a lot. When he returned from a trip to Buffalo, he found his wife waiting for him in a new nightgown with a bottle of champagne. "And what's the occasion?" he asked. "I won," she replied. "Did you win?" "The Nevis Arts Award for an oil painting." "Oh, congratulations." The prize was as much as $500, but more importantly, it was accompanied by an exhibition in the gallery for the winning artists. The New York Times newspaper reviewed the exhibition and highlighted the work of aspiring artist Lynn Campbell. This was followed by a series of gallery exhibitions, with one good review after another. Lynn's name became recognizable, but it did not bring much money. Daniel turned 5 years old, and he had to go to school. The question arose about public or private education. And by that time, he had a younger brother, Derek. While the parents were trying to decide if they could afford a private education, the State University of New York offered Lynn Campbell a position as an assistant professor at Albany. Parker was already a junior partner by that time, but without hesitation packed up and moved in with his wife. It was the best decision for his family, although it did not help advance his career. "I'll get some work," he told Lenore, and that's how it turned out. He found a job as a freelance arbitrator in minor construction disputes. The Joneses bought a dilapidated house in one of the old industrial towns on the east side of the Hudson and settled in it. Lynn turned the top floor of the house into her studio. They had decent incomes for upstate New York. And yet, the artist Lynn Campbell dreamed that one day she would have an exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago. Parker's dream was a happy, peaceful life. When his second son went to college, he thought he had achieved this. But fate was not kind to him. Lenore wasn't feeling well. After much debate, she followed his advice to take advantage of government medical benefits and undergo a medical examination. So began a long cycle of examinations, which ended with a quiet conversation in the oncologist's office. Teddy was getting used to his new existence. Right outside the door of the house was a park called the Commons. There were a lot of dogs playing there, and the people were friendly, but it wasn't the same. He missed Anne, and when it got colder in November, other dogs and people began to appear less often. It was much colder than in the city, and they had few visitors, only a young man and his wife. The young man was not bad. It was Parker's son, Dan. He was as tall as Parker and looked a little like him. But the woman, Dan's wife, didn't like dogs. Teddy noticed it. This woman annoyed Parker. She criticized his house for being old and their neighborhood for being poor. "It's time to go," Parker said, grabbing the leash with one hand and the bag with the other. "The family can wait. And now that my Lenore is gone, we're at the mercy of our relatives for Thanksgiving." However, just as they were about to leave, the phone rang. Parker picked up the phone. "Hello," he said. "Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I didn't want to answer you. The thing is, I need more time." Parker paused, listening to the other man. Teddy lay down on the floor. These calls only made Parker sadder. "Yes, I understand that this is a great honor, and of course, Lenore deserves it, but for now I cannot part with her paintings. I need more time." Parker paused again, listening, and then said, "I promise that I will make a decision soon." Parker hung up the phone and turned to Teddy. "Come on, man. It's time to go." With these words and his slumped shoulders, they left the house and crossed the small back garden, now dark and devoid of flowers, to the black car. Teddy climbed into the back of the truck to take another long, joyless ride. At the end of it, Teddy found himself in a place with perfect lawns and surprisingly similar houses. It seemed that they were outside the city, but there were fewer trees than in the city, and none of the streets went straight, but seemed to meander endlessly. Dan met his father and Teddy at the door. He hugged the older man. Looking past the men, Teddy noticed a frown slip across the woman's face, replaced by an artificial smile. They were shown into a room at the back of the house. There seemed to be almost no stairs, since everything was on the same level. However, there was a cat named Samantha, a big, yellow tabby that hissed at Teddy and then walked away. Parker moved into the back room and then took Teddy out for a long walk. When he wasn't out, Teddy was chained to the back room, but apparently so was Parker, or at least he preferred to stay there with Teddy rather than spend time with his relatives. Parker, Teddy realized, shared the same deep sadness. They both lost the only person who made their lives livable. The next day it was crowded, and late in the morning the guests began to arrive. Teddy was taken out to meet them. A cute brown dog with a friendly and affectionate character was immediately liked by the guests. At the beginning of the day, Parker took Teddy for a walk through the winding narrow streets of the village. When they returned, Parker's son Dan was talking to the couple in the foyer, picking up their coats. "Oh, Dad," Dan said, "let me introduce you to Professor Stevenson and his wife." "Hi, Jean," Parker said to the red-haired woman. She turned to her husband and said, "Frank, this is Parker Jones. His wife was in the hospital at the same time as you." "Nice to finally meet you," Parker said, holding out his hand. Frank Stevenson was a very tall, thin man with the too-gray pallor of a man recovering from a long illness. It was also noticeable that he was almost 2 decades older than his wife, a woman in her 30s. Stevenson accepted Parker's hand reluctantly, with resentment that Teddy could feel. Perhaps it was Parker's good health or the warm smile his wife gave a man who was a good dozen years younger than her husband. "Oh, is that Teddy?" Jean Stevenson exclaimed. Jean squatted down to pet Teddy, and when he hugged her back, she laughed with delight. "Oh, I've heard so much about you from Anne. She was a great woman, and I know you must miss her. But now you have a wonderful man as your host." Getting to her feet, she said, "I'm so glad you took Teddy. I fulfilled Anne's last wish. I know he's going to have a nice home with you." Jean paused and added, "I was so sorry to hear about Lenore. Maybe it was for the best. New York was our last hope. Lenore fought to the end. But there comes a point when the struggle becomes worse than the disease. I know that he and Anne are somewhere together, looking out for Teddy and me." Then Dan, Parker's son, burst in, squeezing his father's hand. He said, "That's right, Dad. Stay positive. And by the way, you and Professor Stevenson will have a lot to talk about. He was my contract professor at Albany Law School. I told him that you were an arbitrator in the construction industry." Frank Stevenson nodded to Parker and moved towards his wife, wrapping his arms around her waist. Frank's movement brought him closer to Teddy, who caught a subtle scent and jumped away from the stranger to hide behind Parker. "What's the matter, boy?" Parker asked, stroking Teddy's head. "Maybe all these new faces are suppressing him," Jean suggested. "Yeah, it's getting too crowded for one dog," Dan said, waving the Stevensons toward the living room. As Jean left, she told Parker, "We have to exchange the latest news later." Jean smiled sadly at Parker over her shoulder as her husband's hand pushed her forward. Parker, for his part, was full of memories. The experimental cancer research took place in New York at Sloan Kettering. It was a long way, but it was their last hope for remission of the cancer that was killing Lenore. They checked in at 5 in the morning on the day of her initial examination. Lenore was wheeled away on a gurney and given formal instructions to Parker where he should wait. Parker wandered around, looking for a waiting room, asking one volunteer or another where he needed to wait. They tried to help him, but they didn't seem to have the slightest idea. Finally, the nurse leaving duty pointed in the right direction, and he found a waiting room. It was a quiet place with a single TV set turned on to a corresponding monotonous program. Fortunately, he settled in with a book he had brought with him. In the early morning hours, the waiting area was relatively empty. There was only Parker, an elderly woman with a young man who might have been her grandson, and an attractive red-haired woman leafing through old magazines in the waiting room. Time passed. The room became sometimes crowded, sometimes empty. Only the red-haired woman remained unchanged. It was past 1 o'clock in the afternoon when his mobile phone rang. A nurse called and said that his wife was being admitted to the hospital and that he could visit her after 5 o'clock in the evening. "There's a decent cafe a few blocks from here," said a red-haired woman standing next to him. Her name was Jean Stevenson, and her husband, Frank, was undergoing the same cancer treatment as Parker's wife. "He's been fighting cancer for almost 5 years now," Jean said over a light green salad at a small cafe 2 blocks from the hospital. "It's been 2 years for us," Parker said, staring at his turkey but still unable to convince himself to take a bite. "But it seems like it's been more, almost forever. And yet, time is so short," Parker reflected. Jean was 37 and had been married for a dozen years to her former law professor, a man 15 years her senior. She was childless and the only survivor of her own family. It was Frank's second bout of cancer, or the third, depending on how you count them. She volunteered details of her life. She was a person in desperate need of someone who could understand her. Parker's great gift as an arbitrator was that people instinctively felt they could trust him. Parker has always shown his natural empathy. However, in this case, he and Jean Stevenson had a common experience and a similar desperate need. "You can't convey how you feel, and you don't dare show your fear," Parker confessed. "I always have to stay positive," Jean replied. They smiled at each other, two people stuck in their roles as carers. It was their first time together. Two people who came to support their spouses gathered together for mutual support. They were lonely because, taking care of the other, they were separated from the flow of the living world around them. Naturally, they were drawn to share their hardships together. The hospital had lists of restaurants and hotels where special prices were provided to the families of patients. Jean and Parker, of course, began to have dinner together late after visiting hours ended. "We often stayed in the same hotel." It happened at the end of December, shortly before Christmas. On the eve of the holiday, New York was illuminated. There was fun everywhere, but it was a dark time for Jean and Parker. Lenore was in the same room with Cummings, a book editor whose family consisted of a brown dog named Teddy. That morning, Parker came to the hospital and found that Anne and Lenore had been transferred to separate rooms. He had been in the hospital long enough to realize that this was not a good sign. Both women were losing the fight against the disease. That night at dinner, Jean was in even worse shape than Parker. "We had a fight," she said. "There was no good news today, and I don't think Frank had a more convenient punching bag." "It's complicated," Parker said. "Pain is bad, but fear is even worse. Lenore is in a private room right now. It might not mean what you think it means, Jean said, reaching out to cover him with her hands. I am not alone in my thoughts. Her roommate, Anne, was also moved in, and she asked me to take her dog in while she was away. They move to a single room when they think the end is near, and understands this, as does Lenore. Jean turned away, startled by the grief of the man on the other side of the table. Noticing that the waiter was noticeably fussed, Jean said, "Oh, we have to go." It was already closer to 11. The hotel staff was waiting for the restaurant to close. They went to Jean's room together. He usually left her at the door and went to his room, but this evening she invited him in. Jean Stevenson had barely made love for 5 years. At the best of times, it was Frank who sought love from her. Like most women, even after marriage, she found it difficult to find a common language. But as the intimacy of love gradually weakened, and then, with the development of the disease, disappeared altogether, Jean experienced a deep sense of loss. She longed for the intimacy that arose during sexual intercourse. Parker had been celibate for almost 2 years. Sometimes he engaged in self-gratification of his own, but mostly he cried, imperceptibly, in the shower. Lenore was usually timid in bed, but she always lost her shyness in the thrill of their mutual pleasure. Lenore was an artist, and Parker was a practical, down-to-earth person. However, in bed with Lenore, he learned to be an artist, playing with all the colors of her love desires. He developed a palette with which to paint a portrait of their marital love. In Jean's hotel room, two unwitting celibates awkwardly reached out to each other. Two desperate people in need of a physical connection. "Would you like a drink?" Jean asked. "I wouldn't mind. It's been a hard day." The drink was followed by a kiss, and it had a much more arousing effect. "We shouldn't do this," Jean said when their lips parted. "You're right," Parker replied, kissing her again. The idea of sleeping with a man who wasn't her husband was both unthinkable and extremely arousing to Jean. As for most women, the most exciting thing about love in a long-term marriage was the thought of love with a non-husband. It's not that wives are unfaithful by nature, but no woman's romantic dreams are related to fidelity. Jean gave herself up to the moment of escape from the painful reality of her life. She grabbed onto the man who was also drowning, and together they reached the lifeboat of oblivion in the sea of despair. In the morning, Jean woke up and found that Parker was already awake and sitting. He sat perfectly still and stared out the window. The window overlooked a bleak city street and a sterile office building. "Do you feel guilty?" Jean asked. "Of course," he replied. "Can you?" "The same thing," she said, sitting up and moving so that her naked body was next to his. "But I'm not sorry," Parker said, and turned to kiss her. "Me too," she said when their lips met. So it all started with what was supposed to be a one-off. Jean went to the pharmacy to get a pill the morning after. It was just a precaution, but she had thought it over a week before her blunder. Soon she had more reliable means of contraception, another precaution, but it turned out to be necessary. When the harsh New York winter turned into a wet spring, they abandoned all pretense and abandoned 2 rooms in favor of one. Parker never stopped feeling guilty, but he didn't think about ending the affair either. He divided his existence into 2 spheres. It allowed him to stay sane, watching cancer take away everything that made sense in his life. He assumed it was the same with Jean, but they never talked about it. Now it has become a taboo topic in that air bubble they occupied when they were together. Every morning he left Jean's to take his place at Lenore's bedside. Every evening he returned a man devastated by mental pain to a woman who suffered no less. They hugged each other, wiping away tears, and pretended that this world was real. In June, everything changed. Summer was only a week away, but it was hot and humid. It was as uncomfortable in New York as it can be in New York. He drove to the hospital from the hotel in the morning heat. Upon arrival, he realized that something had happened. The nurses were silent, but their faces said that the end was near. Lenore spent the day more lucid than she had been a few weeks ago. They talked about little things, recalled the years of their life together. What Dan was like when he was 2 years old, and how different Derek was in infancy. She slept a little and woke up in the afternoon. "I'm sorry, Ed," she said suddenly. He was sitting by her bed, half asleep, watching the depressing news on the cable TV in the room. It took him a moment to respond. "Forgive me. For what, my love? For this. For all this. For putting you through this. He took her hand. Hey, it's not your fault. Anything can happen. We'll get through this together. You'll see. He took her hand and smiled reassuringly, as he hoped. No, I can't take it anymore. Everything is coming to an end. I'm sorry, she said, and tears ran down her face. He was crying too. They were sitting like this. She remembered their life together for a long time. I made him promise that he would move on. Find yourself another one, she said. Don't make her take the first step like I had to. He stayed by her bedside for the rest of the day. At 5 o'clock, she closed her eyes. She fell into a coma. Just after midnight, an alarm sounded on the monitors, but not a scream. It was a quiet, plaintive plea. A nurse came in. An order banning intensive care was signed the day before. Lenore, wife, mother, lover, slipped away. When Parker returned to the hotel early in the morning, he expected to find Jean, but her belongings were missing. Notes too. She didn't leave a farewell message. He later found out that her husband had been discharged. It was a complete remission, one of the success stories of the new treatment. He visited Anne at the hospital to say goodbye, finding her in a bad condition. I'm sorry about Lenore, she began. I'm not supposed to know, but you always hear whispers. She just gave up, Parker said. No, and said, grabbing his arm with all the strength she still had. She accepted the inevitable. That's exactly what she did. Now it's my turn. Don't say that. Why? Because it's not true. No, I have only one regret. Poor Teddy was left all alone in a dark apartment. Liz, my neighbor, walks and feeds him, but she can't take him in because of her cat. He treats cats well, but the cat treats him badly. Poor Teddy is waiting for my return, but I think he knows that this is a lost hope. I guess he realized I was sick before the doctors did. I've been told that dogs can smell cancer. Spaniels are the best. They can detect very faint odors. My poor boy. He needs someone, and I think you need him. Please take it. Parker took Teddy. They've come a long way upstate. The dog and the man were both grieving. They arrived at an empty house. Teddy wandered through the floors. For all but the fourth. At the top of the house was Lenore's old studio. This floor was off limits. Parker didn't go there. I couldn't face my grief. Like Teddy, he lived with a hope that was impossible. The Thanksgiving dinner at the younger Parker's house was a strange event. There were about 20 people present, several family members, as well as secular and professional acquaintances of the newly married couple. Dinner was ordered, and no one could object to the quality or quantity of the food. However, the elder Parker ate very little and shared most of the meal with Teddy, who was in the back room during the feast. After dinner, Parker, avoiding communication, went outside with Teddy. When they had walked quite a bit, Jean caught up with them. They sat down on a lonely bench that stood slightly off the roadway, near what looked like a bus stop, a deserted place in a block of single-family houses with garages for 2 cars. Can we talk? What is it? She asked. Of course, he replied, sitting down. Teddy settled down at his feet. I'm sorry I didn't say goodbye. She began. That's not necessary, he said. We didn't have a real relationship. We just shared a bed for convenience. She sobbed a little at his words and said, I deserve it, I suppose, but we both know that we had something much more. She paused. They were both silent, and then she said, I love you. I understand that this should not have happened. Of course, I didn't want that. But it happened, and then Frank got better. I didn't know how to tell you that. I couldn't find the words to say goodbye. Parker turned to her. She was crying. Please don't, he said. I understand. He is your husband, and he needs you. We've gone too far. No one is to blame for this. I'm sorry, she begged. There's nothing to forgive. But you're lonely. In response, he yanked Teddy's leash, and the dog looked up at them. You're forgetting about Teddy, he said. Jean leaned forward and stroked Teddy's head. He licked her hand, and she smiled back. He's a good companion, but still, we both have a bond that is growing. He has a depth of pain that I can't understand yet, and he's trying to understand me. This is a work in progress. We are the ones who have continued to live. Lenore and Anne's obituaries were published on the same day. That's what they wrote there. Alive in their memory. They listed all their achievements, But both obituaries ended the same way, alive in memory. Now everything depends on us. We have to find our way. And we're working on it, aren't we, boy? Teddy's look was sad even for a spaniel, and Jan wondered how much the dog could understand. Did he really feel the deep grief of the person sitting next to her? I have to go back, she said. I understand. We'll be there soon. On the way, Jean wiped away her tears and adjusted her makeup. She had made the only possible choice, but she was already regretting it. Early the next morning, before his sister-in-law got up, Parker was ready to leave. Before he could slip out, son Dan stopped him to hug and ask, I got a call from the Art Institute of Chicago again. They still want to do an exhibition of Mom's work. They have most of her paintings in public possession and many from private collections. But they need her latest work, and you still have it, Dan said. I know, Parker said. They call me all the time. What's the problem, Dad? It's simple, he began. It's hard to explain. You can't let her go, Dan prodded. In a way, I guess. There's a part of me that thinks the same way as Ted, Parker said, stroking the dog. He still hopes that his mistress will come for him and take him home. He must understand that this will not happen, but he does not lose hope. When they parted, Dan hugged his father tightly and said, We need you, Dad. Please come back soon. Parker promised to come back when he could. Before leaving for home, Parker put Teddy in the front passenger seat of the car. Well, behave yourself, Ted. Sit on the floor and behave yourself. Teddy got used to it, and on the way, whenever he could, Parker bent down and stroked Teddy's head. With this placement, the dog seemed to be much happier. Parker realized that they finally understood each other. Arriving home, they had a late lunch with Teddy's favorite dish, chicken and rice. We walked for a long time after lunch. Finally, for the first time, we climbed the stairs together to the very top of the building. That's where Teddy saw Lenore's studio for the first time. It smelled of paints and turpentine, as well as the musty smell of a long and used room. Canvases were made up along 2 walls. There are unfinished works and supplies on one wall, and finished works on the second. Parker settled into a chair in the center of the room. Teddy was sitting at his feet, resting his head on Parker's lap. Nearby stood an easel with an unfinished painting, Len Campbell's latest work, waiting for a woman who would not return. It was a portrait of her husband. Parker's unfinished image only vaguely resembled himself. It was a portrait of a much younger man, happy, deeply in love. Portrait of a quiet guy following a pretty blonde tour guide at an art museum. The image of a young father and a loving husband who agreed to the job he could get for them. It was not a portrait of a survivor, but an unfinished portrait of an unfinished life. Light streamed through the skylight. Parker took a crumpled news clipping out of his pocket. It occurred to me that I still haven't read Anne's obituary to you. Teddy didn't move as Parker read the death notice of Anne Cummings, the famous book editor. When he reached the end, he said, And here's the part about you. Alive in the memory of my beloved and faithful dog Theodore Bear Cummings, Teddy. Parker paused, and a tear rolled down his cheek. Then he stood up. It's time to clear this room, Teddy. Take these paintings to the Art Institute. There are only 2 of us, but we need to move on. Teddy stretched, scratched his ear, and followed Parker, but he knew he was wrong. They won't be alone for long. A woman named Jean is coming. He caught the scent of her husband. It was weak, but it was getting stronger. You can't fool a dog's nose. Frank Stevenson's cancer is back. Soon, 3 people will remain alive, bound by common pain and doomed to live after the tragedy.